This is Lenny Farlee, and I want you to welcome you today to our presentation on invasive species threatening our Indiana woodlands. And this is going to be our first of two parts. We're going to be looking at both identification today and then also a follow-up on recommended approaches at treatment and management. So be looking for that one to come out as well, and should be hopefully a beneficial two programs that you can utilize to help you identify and then also start addressing and managing the invasive species on your woodland properties. So let's start with a good definition. There's plenty of definitions out there for these invasive species, but I think this is a pretty good one that covers a good amount of territory and is used by quite a few folks. So it's an alien species, meaning it's not native to the area that we find it in, that it's been introduced either accidentally or on purpose, and its introduction is likely to cause damage in one way or another or harm. And so this could be economic, environmental, or even human health. And we'll talk about a couple of examples of that. So how did this stuff happen? How did these get on the landscape? It's often the result of either intentional or accidental introductions and the unintended consequences of these escaping from the plantings they were originally put into natural or other environments. And so we've got a wide variety of examples of this. Many of our invasive species in our woodlands, in terms of plants, were actually introduced as either landscaping or wildlife plants and have subsequently escaped from those intentional plantings and gotten into woodlands. In some cases, there was accidental introduction of these plants through seed or other plant materials that escaped and got into the environment and started spreading. And one good example of an accidental introduction is emerald ash borer, an insect that was accidentally transported here to the United States on wood material underneath bark, probably on pallets or other types of shipping or crating material. The beetle escaped and has been killing ash trees here in North America ever since. And so a good saying to consider on this is the old Pogo cartoon character by Walt Kelly. And he had a famous comment. He said, "We have met the enemy and he is us." And that is often true when it comes to invasive species. There's a kind of a natural biological progression that works with invasive species and a lot of other population dynamics of biological elements. And that is that when something is first introduced, it doesn't look very threatening. And so it may maintain relatively low population levels and not build up real fast until we get to the point where there's reproduction. And so in the case of the plants, when it's large enough to start producing seed, and if those seed are fertile, then there's the potential to produce many more plants. And so as we look at this graphic, the vertical axis on the left is the degree of infestation, how much area is covered by this plant, how much of the landscape can be found on. On the right-hand side are control costs, and so what is it going to cost to actually effectively manage this particular pest? And then on the bottom is time progressing to the right. And so the early stage of the introduction, we oftentimes don't notice this. It's at very low levels. It's perhaps a new plant that we're not familiar with, and so it may go completely unnoticed and unreported. Oftentimes when we get a first detection, there's an opportunity at that point to stop that invasion. So at that point, with low populations, maybe perhaps very little, if any, reproduction yet, there's an opportunity to actually eradicate it on the landscape where it's been introduced. And that's oftentimes the goal with newly introduced invasive species, is to try to detect them very early on and do an eradication process that eliminates the possibility for them to spread across the landscape and continue to cause huge problems. Unfortunately, oftentimes either we don't do the detection fast enough or a rapid response to that detection is not made, and the plants are allowed to stay in place, continue to grow, reproduce, produce seed. Those seed are scattered oftentimes by wind, water, or animals to other locations, and then they have an opportunity to infest those new areas. And before long, we've got this rapid growth up this curve of the population and quickly it becomes much more difficult and much more expensive to manage. And so oftentimes we don't have a recognition or an awareness of the problem until we've gotten to the point where we really don't have an opportunity to eradicate it, and even kind of control of it and management on the landscape becomes difficult and expensive. So in most cases with invasive species that are new to the area, we're trying very hard, number one, through recognition and education to help people recognize these problems and report them so they can respond rapidly. In cases where we've had these invasive species on the landscape over a long period of time, in many cases we're much further along that curve on the right-hand side, and we're strictly working on management to minimize the biological damage done by these pests, because complete eradication is no longer really possible or completely unfeasible, either economically or operationally. So the identification of these plants is really the first step to control of plants that get introduced. Now, our best method is actually prevention. So if we can prevent these plants from ever having the opportunity to land in on our landscape, that is ideal. And so carefully considering what we introduce from other locations is an important part of the screening process before we ever release materials out into the landscape that could have the potential to spread. But once we've got those introductions, the identification of those is critical for us to take active management and recognize the problems we've got on our properties and then address those. And so your first task is to get familiar with what some of these plants look like so you can start scouting your properties and recognize if you've got issues or not. So the list of plants I'm going to provide to you today is certainly not exhaustive. It's a very long list of plant material that has the potential to be invasive in a variety of different landscapes. And the level of infestation and invasiveness varies across the landscape as well. But you can access much more complete lists for Indiana and also regionally and nationally through some of the cooperating websites here. So the Indiana Cooperative Agricultural Pest Survey has a nice listing, and then the Indiana Invasive Species Council is a really nice clearinghouse for kind of all things invasive here in Indiana. And so both of those are good references for getting good lists of what we find here in Indiana that's classified as invasive. So I'm going to walk through some of our more common or emerging invasive plants that threaten particularly woodland environments. There are other pests that are problematic in grasslands, prairies, or young successional sites. There are other plants that are problematic in wetlands. There are some plants that are problematic in agriculture and pastures, but we're going to concentrate on the woodlands today. And so one of the first ones is a problem that historically was primarily a southern Indiana problem, but we're finding it moving north and creating issues in our central and northern Indiana woodlands now as well. And that's a Japanese stilt grass. This is an annual that is actually a relatively small grass. It might get to be up to 3 feet tall, but it has a tendency to have pretty thin stems. Will have oftentimes a tendency to flop over a little bit. So it's oftentimes more of a ground cover than a tall standing weedy grass. Defining characteristics for this plant are it almost looks like a little miniature bamboo. It's got these long, elongated leaves. They're actually not especially large, though. They're oftentimes 2 to 4 inches in length. But one of the really nice defining characteristics for this is this silvery midrib that we see down the center of the leaf. And that's a good defining characteristic that'll help you separate it from some others that are somewhat lookalikes in terms of the leaf appearance and pattern. This will be found along roadsides, trails. It will tolerate shade, so it'll move in from those locations where seed has been spread and start infesting the interior areas of forests. If you're a spring wildflower lover, garlic mustard is one of your worst enemies if you know it or not. This is a biennial, and it's an herb that was intentionally brought here because, true to its name, it has a garlicky flavor and odor to it, and it's in the mustard family, so it is edible. It typically, the first year, will have this kind of small basal rosette with these kidney-shaped leaves with kind of this rounded, wavy margin on the outside edge. next year, in the early spring, it will start shooting up a stem or multiple stems per plant that have these four-petaled white flowers, and it can produce an enormous amount of flowers and therefore an enormous amount of seeds. And the leaves on these stems have a tendency to be more heart-shaped, but still have that wavy margin to them. These seeds are stored in the soil for anywhere from 5 to 10 years. And so one of our objectives in managing this plant is to trying to prevent seed set because of that stored seed. Once that seed hits the ground, it's very hard to know when those are going to germinate again, and it's a constant source of new plants. It's a very aggressive plant and produces an enormous amount of seed and can simply overwhelm many of our early spring wildflowers. By mid-season, these plants are usually dying back and casting their seed. And so spring is really the time you want to be watching for these, although the first season basal rosettes can actually be pretty green through most of the winter. And once it warms up enough in either late fall or early spring, 50 degrees plus, there may be opportunities to use herbicides on those or pull them for control. A emerging invasive plant here in Indiana is Japanese chaff flower. This is currently found mostly on the Ohio River Valley border counties, but has potential to start moving around partly because the seed that we see here is somewhat like a burr or stick tight and will cling to fur, and so animals can transport this pretty readily. It has opposite leaf arrangement, forms relatively dense stands through a lot of seed drop, and has these kind of swollen reddish enlargements at the nodes of the plants where the leaves and the stems meet, and can form very thick cover and does tolerate some shade. So it, once again, very much like garlic mustard and Japanese stilt grass, presents a real threat to our understory plants here in Indiana. A plant that fortunately we don't have a lot of here in Indiana, it's just been reported from very few counties, is giant hogweed. This particular plant, though, presents some significant risks, not only environmentally, but also physically, health-wise. This plant has a sap that is photoreactive and can produce a significant, what looks like second-degree burn, blistering, and also eye damage up to and including blindness. And so handling this plant is a matter of careful concern and typically should not be done by landowners. If you think you've got this, this is something you'd want to report to the DNR or extension so that could be confirmed, and then we could actually arrange to have folks with the proper protective equipment do the control. This is an enormous plant. You can see the scale of the plant itself. Planted for ornamental purposes because of that massive scale and those huge white blooms. But the problem is it produces gobs of seed that are easily distributed and becomes a very aggressive weed in the environment. This whole structure right here is one leaf. And so we really don't have any other plants in Indiana that have the same scale as this particular plant. We do have cow parsnip and a couple of others in that same broad carrot family that will have a white bloom that's relatively large like this, but none of them have this massive leaf or this enormous size compared to giant hogweed. And as I mentioned, this is not a plant that you want to take on yourself for control. This is one you want to report. Because of that toxic sap, you need significant protective gear and careful attention to detail when control of this is taken. Without that, this is the result. And so the sap, if it gets on the skin or in the eyes, reacts with the sun and can create blistering or permanent damage depending on its location. So definitely caution and making sure that you're not messing with that. Just reporting it is the word of the day. Japanese knotweed is a herbaceous plant, but it actually gets to be quite large. Looks a little bit like a shrub, kind of an arching form to it, very attractive, and that's one of the reasons it was planted, no doubt. These heart-shaped leaves and then the flower clusters coming out from the joints where the leaves meet the stems, and called knotweed because it does have these joints where the leaves and the flowers come together on the stems. It forms very large colonies. I jokingly say this guy's looking for his car in there because it also grows very fast and can just completely overrun some areas. Has an enormous root system that produces all these sprouts, and that in fact makes it a difficult plant to control. So early detection and rapid response to control these infestations will certainly save time and effort. Japanese hops is a climbing vine that we can find in a variety of different habitats, although I've typically seen it in lower moist to wet soil areas, including some of the river bottoms. We do have a native hops. Japanese hops typically has 5 or more lobes on the leaves, and the leaf stems are as long or longer than the leaves themselves. Our native hops have leaf stems that are shorter than the actual leaves, and usually 3 and sometimes 5 lobes. So there is potential for confusion there, but if you look at the consistent pattern, the majority pattern across the leaves, whether they're 5 or more lobes and longer leaf stems, that'll help you identify Japanese hops from our natives. This is an aggressive plant that can grow very quickly and cover over vegetation and produce a fair amount of seeds, so it has the potential to be quite a bit of a problem and cause damage to native vegetation and overrunning areas, making it difficult to manage. A plant that we've been dealing with on the landscape for a long time here in Indiana, particularly in southern Indiana, is Japanese honeysuckle. This is a vine that produces a significant ground cover, but as you can see, also climbs up into trees. You'll also notice that this is a post-growing season shot, and so all of our leaves from our native hardwoods have hit the ground, but Japanese honeysuckle is still nice and green. That's one of the characteristics of this plant. It has a tendency to stay green longer and green up quicker than our natives, giving it a growth advantage, but also helping you with identification. Opposite leaf arrangement, as is the case with the honeysuckles, and these attractive and nice smelling honeysuckle flowers, one of the reasons it was planted, but because of its aggressive growth and shade tolerance and ability to produce seed, it presents significant threats to our landscapes. And it's not limited to southern Indiana anymore. I have fought this on parts of my property here in central Indiana. And so as we get somewhat milder winters at times and different seasons and movement of materials, this is probably a threat really across the state. Another plant that was introduced as an ornamental is Oriental Bittersweet. Now we do have a native bittersweet that I'll mention here in a little bit. This one is much more aggressive, produces loads and loads of fruit, grows very rapidly. It's been called the kudzu of the north in some cases because of its characteristics to overgrow trees and other vegetation. It has paddle-shaped leaves, and so very rounded leaves with just a little notch tip at the end, much more rounded than our native bittersweet, and it produces fruit all along the vines. Almost anywhere where leaves come out, it can produce fruit. Our native bittersweet will typically only produce fruit at the very ends of the side stems or the terminal ends of the vines. So less fruit production and not nearly as aggressive grower. So Oriental Bittersweet was no doubt planted because of this exceptional fruit production, because of the attractiveness of the fruit, but therein lies part of the problem, that it's just producing many, many seedlings and also being spread around the landscape by birds eating the seed and redepositing them in low locations. The seed and fruit of Oriental Bittersweet is slightly different colored than our native bittersweet. These outside holes that open up to expose the seed on the fruit on the inside are more of a yellow. With our native bittersweet, they tend toward more of an orange color. And you can see the aggressive growth pattern of this, how it has the potential to act very much like kudzu, completely overrunning vegetation due to its aggressive growth and enormous fruit production. Our Native American bittersweet, much less paddle-shaped leaves. These are more elongated leaves, very much like a cherry or an apple. This is really kind of what they resemble, alternate leaf arrangement. And you can see the fruit there on the left. The one on the lower end is gradually ripening up. You can see that hole is quite a bit more orange in color than the bright yellow color of the Oriental Bittersweet. And unfortunately, Oriental Bittersweet is starting to cross also with our Native American Bittersweet, and so producing a hybrid that may even present additional problems and actually threatening the genetic purity of our Native American Bittersweet itself. Another aggressive vine that's been probably planted here in Indiana for over 150 years is Wintercreeper. I've heard this called graveyard ivy at times, a variety of other names associated with it. This is a very shade tolerant plant that can produce almost a solid ground cover of this green waxy foliage that looks almost like a fake plant, like a plastic plant. Opposite leaf arrangement, uh, medium to dark green foliage in most cases, and then these whiter leaf veins and a white midrib on the leaf are good diagnostic characteristics. It is oftentimes found as a ground cover, but it will climb up the sides of the trees, send out side branches, making the trees look like they've got all these small, short limbs sticking out, but it's almost evergreen foliage that stays green nearly the whole winter. And if they get up into the tops of the trees where they can get some sunlight, they will produce seed with these small yellowish white flowers. The other problematic vine that we're finding starting to emerge on the landscape more and more are the Chinese and Japanese wisterias. Totally understandable why people would want to plant these with the beautiful purplish to light lavender flowers in the spring, but the problem is that once again, seed spread happens. It's a very fast growing, aggressive vine, and so all of the light lavender purple that you see in this photo is actually the flowers from these Oriental wisterias that have run up into native hardwood trees. So once again, acting very much like kudzu. Now, in fact, we do have some native wisterias here to the Midwest. They're not technically native to Indiana, but they are found in places like Kentucky and some other local Midwestern states. The Japanese and Chinese wisterias can be differentiated because their young stems tend to be very hairy, and they will set flowers before the leaves fully emerge. And so they're putting on flowers relatively early in the spring before we get full leaf emergence. Our natives will typically not flower until the leaves have come out and expanded fully. And there are some good natives. The American wisterias are a good replacement. I believe Blue Moon is one of the varieties that's available in the trade that is a native species here to eastern North America. So there's that. The reason people plant this, that attractive purplish to lavender bloom. The problem is these things can grow incredibly fast, and obviously with all that blooming produce an enormous amount of seed. And you can see the bloom is completely out, but the leaves are not yet fully extended yet for this particular specimen. Compound leaves on a fast-growing vine. Leaves look a little bit like ash. Another plant that is probably infamous at this point in time due to its overrunning a lot of different agricultural and natural landscape areas is Multiflora rose. This was intentionally planted for a variety of different purposes. Escaped from planting because of birds eating the seed and scattering the seed around the landscape. Compound leaves. We do have several native rose species, and one way to tell our native roses from Multiflora rose is if we look at the base of that compound leaf where it attaches to the stem or the cane, we'll see what's called a stipule. It's a little expansion at the base of the leaf, almost like a little wing on either side of that leaf stem. And the stipules on Multiflora rose have these little projections or hairs coming off of them. We won't find that typically on our natives. And so that's a good identifying characteristic between our natives and Multiflora rose. Multiflora rose, as it says, produces lots of flowers. They're typically white but can be pinkish and borne in clusters. Oftentimes our native roses will have more solitary or smaller numbers of clustered flowers. The flowers themselves can be a little larger and typically more of a pink to almost a red color. Very attractive. And going along with those smaller but multiple flowers, the hips on multiflora rows that are produced by those flowers, oftentimes many of them in a flower cluster, and relatively small, typically a quarter an inch or so or less. Many of our native roses have fewer hips, but they're larger, oftentimes a half inch or so. Asian bush honeysuckle, particularly common here in the Lafayette area and problematic across the state depending on the habitats. This is a shade-tolerant shrub that will invade forest understories and gradually build up to the place where it's almost the exclusive plant in those locations, crowding out and shading out almost everything else underneath it. Opposite leaf arrangement, rather, I think, I guess I'm probably biased, but I think rather ugly, kind of grayish stems. If we cut the stem, what we find is a hollow pith with a little bit of a brown center or tan center. That's a good identifying characteristic because we've got some other species, including the viburnums and dogwoods, that are native shrubs here in Indiana that also have opposite leaf arrangement, but they will typically have a solid pith. And so nice identification characteristic, and you can just break these stems in half if you don't have a knife on you and still tell that that's got a hollow center on the inside. We have several different species and some hybrids in the state, and so this picture on the lower right demonstrates some color differences and texture differences, but that hollow pith and opposite leaf arrangement is consistent. In the fall, we will find these reddish to orangish, relatively juicy berries. The birds will eat them, but they're not a great food value, but that eating of those berries spreads them across the landscape and thus allows the plant to establish in new locations. And with the shade tolerance, continue to cause significant problems. Another plant we brought here for wildlife purposes and a variety of other conservation applications, but has become a weed species, is autumn olive. Autumn olive has alternate leaf arrangement. You can see the rather elongated leaves. And one great identification characteristic for autumn olive is we flip it over on the underside. It's got this very distinctive silvery speckling on the undersides of the leaves, almost like looks like a silver coating. We'll see that speckling on some of the younger twigs as well. This plant can produce an enormous amount of fruit and is actually sought after by wildlife and will be spread around the landscape, producing new plants. This plant can fix nitrogen, which provides it a competitive advantage over some of our other plants and also provides it the opportunity to establish in very difficult growing locations where other plants maybe don't do as well. So it is truly a weed in name for sure because of those characteristics of lots of fruit production, aggressive growth, and the capacity to outcompete our native plants. The older stems on this large shrub tend to be gray in color with smooth to just some slight flaking or ridging on the bark. Younger sprouts and stems oftentimes will have kind of a tan to brown color. Privet, which started as a landscape plant, the old privet hedges around homes in town. If it's allowed to go to seed, the birds will eat the seeds, scatter them across the landscape, and because it is shade tolerant, it can become a pretty significant understory weedy, reedy bush, tolerant of shade, even able to flower and produce fruit in shade. And I tend to find it more on moist soil areas where we've got high quality soils and sites, oftentimes near streams or moist ground that supports the growth of this particular plant. But it's a pretty tough plant, and I'm sure can be found in other locations as well. Produces a lot of seed and a lot of seedlings many times, even in shade. And so I oftentimes find communities of seedlings under the mature plants when we find it out in the landscape. Opposite leaf arrangement. This rounded leaf, oftentimes a little waxy on top, white blooms, followed by purplish to very dark, almost black berries. Jet bead, not a real common shrub invasive on our landscape, but it is starting to emerge in a few locations. Looks a little bit like some of our native viburnums, opposite leaf arrangement, compound or a doubly serrate toothing on the leaves. This very distinctive elongation of the leaf tip is a good characteristic. What gives it its name is the black uh, bead-like seeds that it produces, and one of the reasons, no doubt, it was planted was for ornamental purposes. Very attractive four-petaled white flowers, but because it is shade tolerant and no doubt birds and other wildlife scatter the seed, it has the potential to be invasive, and we have found it in several locations across Indiana in shaded conditions and woodland settings. Japanese barberry is a landscape plant that's been used for many years, and we still find it commonly in the landscape. Oftentimes, the landscape plants are the kind of a maroon colored selection. When we find them regenerating out in the wild from seed from those landscape plants, oftentimes they've reverted back to a more of a green color. But in any case, in either way, we'll typically see these paddle-shaped leaves that are oftentimes held in one location, kind of coming out from one little node. So multiple leaves popping out from one location, and oftentimes there's also a thorn at that location as well. Very shade tolerant and able to produce fruit in shade, so it can reproduce itself even in the shade of the understory and gradually build up in populations. These little bell-shaped yellow flowers in the spring. You can see over here on the left-hand side one of those thorns. So that is not something you want becoming common in the understory of your forest, obviously. Wing burning bush is another very commonly used landscape plant due to its beautiful red fall color, but also, once again, invasive with seed production and shade tolerance. It can readily move into the forest landscape. And in terms of its approach to invasiveness, looks very much like Asian bush honeysuckle. Kind of occupies the shrub layer, crowding out other species and producing lots and lots of seedlings that will grow up underneath the canopy of the large parent trees. It's called wing burning bush because of these corky ridges found on the stems. Pardon me, these are not always found on the stems of the plants, but are pretty typical and common for many of the specimens we run into. Even smaller plants like the picture here on the left will have those corky wing extensions on many of the stems. Opposite leaf arrangement, relatively small elongated leaves, and this significant magenta to red color in the fall. And here's an example of forest understory being overrun by wing burning bush. The color in the shade tends to be a little more muted than what we see out in the sunlight of the landscape plants, where it's very bright red. These oftentimes tend to be more of a pinkish to a kind of a washed out red in color in the shade. Glossy buckthorn is a small tree, large shrub, mostly found in wetland areas, but it's a very significant invasive species in those areas because it has a tendency to shade out and outcompete many of the other native plants. It has a parallel leaf venation that reminds me to some extent of the leaf venation on dogwoods, shiny leaves, and an interesting alternate and sometimes opposite leaf arrangement. And so the leaves can be either alternately or oppositely arranged on the same twigs and plants. And as mentioned, is more typical of wetlands. Lots of fruit production on this. Another characteristic is if we shave some of the bark off, oftentimes we see a yellowish to orange color as the underbark, and that can be a good identifying characteristic. The berries will start out green, turn to red, and gradually go to almost a black, and once again, very abundant on the plant. Its cousin European buckthorn is more a species of the uplands, and this is once again a large shrub to small tree. The bark is reminiscent of cherry to some extent, but once again, if we shave the outer bark off, we'll oftentimes find that yellowish to orange underbark. And once again, also opposite to alternate leaf arrangement on the same stems. More rounded leaves and still have that somewhat parallel, almost dogwood-like leaf venation. And once again, same story, lots and lots of fruit production on these plants, and that's one of the reasons they become so aggressive and spread around the landscape. A very significant threat to our forest environment is tree of heaven. This is a very fast-growing large tree that also produces large root sprout colonies. And so it has a variety of characteristics that provide it an advantage in our forest environments. It can grow up in some shade. It has a small wind-blown wing seed that can spread far and wide. Once it gets established, it grows incredibly quickly, faster than most of our any native species have the capacity to grow, and produces root sprout colonies from the root system of that parent plant that can gradually occupy large areas in the forest and crowd our native species out. I've personally found a few patches of tree of heaven here in central and northern Indiana that were approaching an acre and almost exclusively tree of heaven, and in some cases so dense it was hard to walk through them. Very large, stout twigs. If we cut those twigs, we will see inside a pith that is a salmon to tan color. And you'll notice anytime you damage this plant, any part of it, or the leaves, the stems, the bark, you get this very disagreeable, smelly odor, almost like rotten peanut butter. I've heard it described. And so in some cases, it actually is called stink tree. Large compound leaves that make me think of either walnut or sumac, but we can separate it from walnut and sumac with a characteristic or two, which we'll show you. You can also see the wing seeds here that typically start out green and then turn oftentimes a reddish or orangish, and then will be brown, but are scattered by wind far and wide. And the leaflets on these large compound leaves, unlike walnut or sumac, will have this little notch on top and bottom near where the base of the leaflet is. On walnuts, this is absent, and on sumac, there are teeth typically all along the margin of the leaflets. Callery pear is a small to medium-sized ornamental tree that has escaped into our landscape, and this has been one of the fastest moving invasions I think I have ever seen. It is phenomenal how quickly this species has spread across the landscape. For years and years, there was a variety of Callery pear called Bradford pear that was planted ornamentally. It was almost the exclusive variety on the landscape, and it was sterile, could not produce fertile seed. But it had a very bad branching form that would gradually create a situation where the tree would fall apart when it was maybe 20 or 25 years old. So there was some breeding programs done to select some other varieties that had better branching form, and these have been since planted. The problem is they've crossed with that Bradford and are producing fertile seed. Birds are now eating that seed, and it's being scattered far and wide on the landscape, and we're finding it's a very aggressive grower and occupying lots and lots of areas. If you look this spring as you drive, you'll see these clusters of white on the roadsides or right-of-ways, and almost invariably that is Callery pear. So with that enormous flowering and seed production, the potential to spread is huge. It will flower before almost anything else flowers in Indiana in terms of our native trees, and produce this large little pear crop that the birds will utilize, and then stays green or with fall color much later into the fall than most of our natives as well. And so here we've got a picture of the fall color. No doubt a beautiful tree, but because of the environmental threat, definitely not one we should be continuing to plant. Another tree that's been planted in landscapes for many, many years is Norway maple. In many cases, we'll find this regular green variety, the standard variety, but there is also a maroon colored variety. It goes under a variety names, Crimson King being one, that has been commonly used in landscaping. Norway maple looks a lot like sugar maple. You can see those leaves are very reminiscent, and its characteristics are similar to sugar maple in terms of shade tolerance. It can tolerate a lot of shade, and seed can germinate readily in the shade of the forest. And so we're finding it invading our forest areas and starting to outcompete some of our native tree species because of that shade tolerance. To differentiate Norway maple from our native sugar maple, we can look at the leaf, and the leaf is typically a little broader than it is long. And so in sugar maple, our leaves are actually pretty comparable in terms of the width versus the length of that leaf. The other thing we can do is break off the leaf stem and squeeze it, and on Norway maple, that sap that comes out will be a milky color. In sugar maple, it's clear. The fruit or the seeds of Norway maple. It's called a samara. It's a paired seed. Essentially, it helicopters or flies away from the plant when it's ripe. This is born until late summer or fall when it finally ripens, very much like our hard maples, which include sugar maple and black maple here in Indiana. I call this particular seed arrangement the handlebar mustache, so kind of sticking out on both sides. Our sugar maple, the wings point down away from the seed, and so it looks a little more like a Fu Manchu mustache. And so that's one of the other characteristics I use to tell these two plants apart. And we have some other potential bad actors starting to emerge on the landscape. Not widely spread yet, but definitely ones we want to keep an eye on. About 3 or 4 years ago, district forester Jason Waterman in southern Indiana, Fayette County, was looking at his property and ran into about a 1/4 acre of this particular plant that was later identified as castor aralia, or prickly castor oil tree. This tree is in the ginseng family, but actually gets to be quite a large tree, 50, 60 feet tall. It has these attractive 7-lobed leaves, but definitely a downside. It produces these sprouts with these enormous thorns on them. And he said this 1/4 acre was quite heavily infested and obviously not going to be very much fun to walk through. It produces large flower clusters that produce lots and lots of small seed that birds will utilize. And so natural, easy spread across the landscape. So once again, early detection and rapid response to control the infestations, and then making sure that we're not planting species like this in our ornamental settings that are going to produce problems for us in the future will help us maintain some control on the environmental degradation and problems created by invasive plant species. So this is just kind of a beginning of the identification of invasive plants. We've covered some of them that are common, some that are emerging. There's lots of other great resources you can tap into to learn more about this, both in terms of identification, control, and other resources and assistance available to you. The Midwest Invasive Plant Network is a wealth of information on invasives, including a really good control database that talks about a lot of different control techniques. I refer to it regularly on species that I'm not familiar with. The Indiana Invasive Species Council, once again mentioned as a great clearinghouse of information. If you have a smartphone and want to report invasive species, there are some great web apps that you can utilize for actually reporting invasive species in the field. This is an important activity that helps us identify where infestations are and how rapidly they're expanding, and give us an opportunity to get ahead of those if it's a new plant. The USDA Forest Service also has some good field guides on invasive species identification and management. Once again, Indiana Cooperative Agricultural Pest Survey, it provides good listings. And for identification, if you have a plant that you can't identify and you're willing to spend a little bit of money, I think it's about $11 a sample, you can actually send a sample in or even photos in to the Purdue Plant Pest Diagnostic Lab for a potential identification. So that is one option available to you, although there are plenty of resources available for identification, including sending photos to your county extension educator, your district forester, or folks like myself, extension specialists. So I want to thank you for joining us for this program. If you have questions, feel free to contact me, Lenny Farlee, Extension Forester at Purdue University. Once again, we appreciate your attendance.